Welcome back to Sir Nightshade. Today, we're diving into 8 truly disturbing stories from the deep, dark woods of the Appalachian Mountains. These are tales of people who ventured into the wilderness and encountered things they were never meant to see. These stories serve as a chilling reminder that some places are better left unexplored. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with your friends. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Thanks. And now, let's get started. I grew up in a tiny town called Elkford. You've likely never heard of it. And honestly, most people haven't. To be blunt, it's just a scattering of houses, wedged deep into a fold of the Allegheny foothills. The kind of place the interstate deliberately seems to forget. No stoplights, no gas stations. Just one bait shop that sells coffee so old and stale, it tastes like you're drinking burnt cardboard mixed with rust. The house I ended up in, it belonged to my uncle. It wasn't in town. It was outside of it. People just called it the place on Nolan's Hollow, as if the name itself explained everything. Like a warning, it's a 2-story, narrow house, built with wood so old it's turned a sickly, weathered gray. The foundation is just stacked fieldstone. It's cracked in places so badly you could drop a set of keys through the gaps. It looks like it's constantly trying to settle back, to sink into the earth. For most of my life, I only visited here for Thanksgiving, and even then, I hated staying after the sun went down. The place has this invisible weight on you, a heavy, observing silence. But then, last December, after everything in my life went sideways, I decided to move in. I told myself it was temporary, a sabbatical, a place to get my head straight, and figure out the next step. My girlfriend of 5 years had just left. My hours at the mechanic shop were cut to almost nothing. And my mom kept calling to ask if I was holding up okay, which is her code for, "I think you're about to fall apart." And maybe she wasn't wrong. So, I threw a mattress, a few boxes of books, and some clothes into my beat-up truck and drove out there, right in the middle of a freezing winter rain. The rain turned the roads into sheets of black ice. The first couple of weeks, honestly, weren't too bad. The days were quiet, filled with mindless, manual labor. I chopped wood, patched up the worst drafts, and sat on the porch with instant coffee that tasted just as awful as the stuff at the bait shop, But at night, at night, the house always found a way to remind me that I was completely, utterly alone. The old beams would creak, but not randomly. They would make slow, deliberate pop sounds, one after the other, making me unable to stop imagining someone pacing overhead. I tried not to think about it. I kept the generator gassed up, the propane tanks lined up, and yeah, I kept a heavy revolver in a locked case by the bed. Not because I thought I'd need it, but because in Elkford, everyone considers it standard operating procedure. Out here, you never assume you're safe just because the door is locked. You assume you're alone, until proven otherwise. That night, things started off routine. I made ramen, which tasted like heated up glue. I read an old novel I'd already read twice. And then, I did the familiar ritual, the door checks. I've developed this strange, almost obsessive habit of double-checking the deadbolts before bed. I guess part of me needed to physically see the brass bolt engaged, to believe it could stop whatever was outside. It must have been around 10 o'clock. That's when I heard the first sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint, hesitant scratching, like something thin was being dragged across the wooden porch floor. For a moment, I didn't even bother to look up from my book. It's the woods. There are animals. Stray cats and raccoons often came onto the railing looking for scraps. But then it came again, this time longer. A dry, rustling noise, like dead leaves being shuffled in a circle, and it ended with 3 light knocks on the door. Tap, tap, tap. Too soft to be a person, but too rhythmic to be an animal. I put my book face down and walked over to the window right next to the front door. The porch was empty. The old, beat-up rocking chair sat perfectly still, unmoving in the biting cold. I cracked the door, just a sliver. A raw blast of cold air hit my face instantly. It smelled musty and faintly sour. The smell of leaves left to rot for too long. I leaned out, just enough to peek left, then right, along the length of the porch. Nothing moved. There were no footprints on the muddy ground leading up to the steps. No sign of anyone. I slammed the door shut and locked it. My shoulders hunched up, tight around my ears, like I was waiting for something in the darkness to lunge at me. I killed the main lamp, and the room was plunged into darkness. I returned to my chair. My eyes adjusted. Shapes appeared. The deep sag of the sofa, the stack of firewood, the small green light of the generator reflecting from the kitchen. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a skunk, or a branch hitting the siding. But then, just before midnight, the knocking returned. This time, there was no mistaking it. 3 short, deliberate knocks. Knock, knock, knock. A calm knock. Measured, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there felt absolutely no need to rush. I shot out of my chair, so fast that the book on the table hit the floor with a dry thud. I didn't shout. I didn't ask, "Who is it?" You don't do that out here. I just walked over and placed the flat of my palm against the door. The wood was freezing, and it felt almost wet. "Hello?" My voice was barely a whisper. No response. No shuffling feet. No creaking porch. I pressed my eye to the tiny peephole. The porch, exactly as before, empty. I backed away. My heart was pounding so hard I felt dizzy, like I'd just run a mile. I returned to the chair, but this time, I pulled the revolver out of the case and set it on my lap. The cold steel felt heavy and really. I told myself it was all in my head. An old house, alone in the woods. What's strange about creaks and knocks? An hour dragged by. I didn't dare move. Finally, the coiled tension began to ease. My hand was numb from holding the position for so long. A part of me started to believe that it was over, that whatever it was, it had given up and left. I stood up, stretching. My legs were stiff and clumsy. I figured I should just head upstairs, check the windows one more time, and try to get some sleep. And the moment I thought it was over, I heard it. Footsteps. Upstairs. No, this wasn't the settling creak of old wood. Not the house breathing in the night. These were real footsteps. Slow, distinct, and tibish. Sen, heavy. They were moving, starting from the far end of the hallway, coming straight toward the top of the stairs. I froze. The blood in my body seemed to turn to sludge. I gripped the revolver so tightly my knuckles went white and began to ache. I held my breath, waiting, praying for it to stop. But the steps came again, heavier now. Thump, thump, thump. Heading back the other way, toward the spare room. They were deliberate, almost. Mocking, as if it wanted me to hear them, as if it was waiting for me. My eyes flicked to the lamp. I turned it on. The pale circle of light only made the surrounding shadows look deeper. My hand instinctively reached for the gun case on the table. And that's when I noticed, it was unlocked. I had forgotten to secure it after cleaning the gun last week. A solid chill ran down my spine. I checked the cylinder. Loaded. I walked to the foot of the stairs, my legs feeling like lead. "Is anyone up there?" My voice cracked, sounding pathetic in the silence. No answer, of course. I put my foot on the first step. It groaned mournfully, echoing. Instantly, the footsteps upstairs started up again, back and forth, back and forth. It was pacing, keeping rhythm with me. I reached the landing. Each step felt heavier than the last. My uncle's old bedroom door was cracked open, just a sliver of blackness. I raised the gun, my arm shaking badly. My other hand fumbled for the light switch. I flipped it. Nothing. The bulb was burned out. Or was it never working? I used my shoulder to shove the door open, ready for anything. The room was empty. A bare mattress, an empty wardrobe. The window was bolted shut from the inside. I backed out slowly, eyes wide, and closed the door. I turned toward my own bedroom at the end of the hall, and that's when I heard it. A whisper. It was coming from the other side of my door. A thin, dry, papery voice, repeating the same phrase in a language I had never heard in my life. I held my breath. I crept closer, pressing my ear to the wood. I could feel my own pulse thudding against the grain, drowning out the murmur. I took a deep, insufficient breath and swung the door wide open. Silence. The room looked exactly as I had left it. The unmade bed, my duffel bag, and then, in my peripheral vision, something moved. A shape slid along the far wall. It glided out of the darkness of the closet. It was tall, impossibly tall, rail thin, and draped in what looked like old winding cloth, something that belonged beneath the earth. I snapped the gun up, my finger tightening on the trigger. But before I could fire, before my brain could even issue the command, the shadow was gone. It slid out the door, into the hallway, quick as a thought. I stumbled back, hitting my spine against the wardrobe. I didn't think anymore. I didn't fight. I ran. I flew down the stairs, taking 3 at a time. I blew through the front door, charging across the yard. My boots slipped on the frozen gravel, but I didn't stop. I just ran, booking it until I reached the bend where the trees thinned out onto the main road. I stopped there, hunched over, gasping for air. My throat was raw, and it tasted metallic, like blood. After a minute, I turned back. The house stood there, pitch black and utterly silent. I stayed there, shivering in the bone-deep cold, until the first gray streaks of dawn appeared. And I never went back. I grew up right on the northern edge of Ridgefield Valley. You have to understand, edge out here doesn't mean close to a town. It means the last place the road still exists. My grandparents' cabin sat in a small clearing, which seemed to be the only open space for miles. If you stood on the porch, you could feel the forest. It didn't just surround you, it besieged you. It felt like standing at the bottom of a deep, green ocean, and 1,000 ancient tree trunks were silently observing, waiting. As a child, I found that comforting, like a natural fortress. I always believed nothing could cross those trees unless my grandfather allowed it. He was that kind of man. He seemed to be part of the forest himself, an old gatekeeper. If a branch snapped at the edge of the woods, he'd look up from his coffee and nod, a slow, knowing acknowledgement, as if he and the forest had just had a private exchange. Back then, I believed nothing could surprise him, and that confidence of his, somehow, bled into me. It's strange how fast that absolute sense of security can just evaporate. After they passed, my grandfather first, my grandmother a few years later, the fortress was left without a warden. The land, the house, and whatever lurked in the forest's shadows were abandoned. And that responsibility, of course, fell to me. But I stalled. I avoided it for 15 years. To be honest, I was afraid. Not of ghosts, but of the fear of that lost security. Afraid to face the silence in a place where I only remembered my grandmother's laughter. Until last October, when a cold letter from an attorney forced my hand. Legal papers don't care about sentiments, huh? And so I drove back. 15 years is a long time. The paved road became gravel, then narrowed into a track barely wide enough for one vehicle. It was sunk deep like a scar in the earth, with heavy ruts on either side. My little sedan looked ridiculously out of place. I constantly had to ride the tires up on the center ridge so the undercarriage wouldn't hit the rocks. It was terrifyingly quiet out there. A thick, suffocating silence. No traffic, no houses, not even power lines. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. You are completely, utterly alone. I remember gripping the steering wheel and telling myself, only 3 nights. That was the deal I made. 3 nights to sort through things, sign the papers, and turn the place into a permanent memory. When I reached the clearing, the sun was already sinking behind the tree line. The porch looked worse than I'd imagined, the boards sagging, almost touching the ground, as if they were too tired to stand up. I had to step around one completely rotten plank to reach the door. I put my hand on the lock, and this was the first strange thing. It turned. It turned effortlessly, without a hitch. It was so easy that my stomach clenched, as if 15 years hadn't passed at all, as if the house had been sitting there, unlocked, inviting me in. Inside, the first thing that hit me was the smell, a punch of memory, old wood, mothballs, and something else. Something sour, something wet. It was the scent of neglect, the smell of something organic, slowly decaying in the dark. It brought a wave of memories I wasn't ready for. My grandmother's hum, my grandfather's heavy boots by the back door. I stood there for a minute, feeling like I had just entered a museum of abandonment. Most of the dishes were still there. A stack of old newspapers sat on the counter, 2 years old, their corners curled up. My grandmother's knitting basket was still beneath her chair, the half-finished scarf draped over the edge. The needles were exactly where she'd left them, waiting for hands that would never return. As darkness settled, I finished boxing the kitchenware. My phone, predictably, was useless. Not a single bar of service. I walked around the house, holding it up to the windows, and finally, in the corner of the kitchen, I caught a fluttering signal, just long enough to text my brother. Made it. I stood by the sink, eating a cold sandwich, looking out the window, into the trees. They were now a solid, impenetrable black wall. The feeling was exactly the same as when I was a child. As if you stared long enough, something might just blink back. Except tonight, the feeling wasn't a question. It was a statement. It knew I was home. I went to bed early that night. Honestly, there was nothing else to do. No TV, no internet, just the sound of the old grandfather clock in the hall. It was a cold, regular tick-tock, like a mechanical heart in a dead house. I lay on the sagging mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak and settle. Every small sound seemed amplified by the heavy silence of the valley. I don't know what time I woke up. I only know it was pitch black. At first, I thought nothing of it, just the usual snap and groan of an old place cooling down. But then, I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the house itself. A scratching, slow, deliberate, directly beneath the floorboards. I froze. My heart hammered in my throat. I immediately tried to rationalize it. It's just an animal. A raccoon or a possum digging underneath. Normal stuff out here. But a rational part of me knew. I was lying to myself. The sound. It was too rhythmic, too steady, animals scratch randomly, frantically, and loudly. This was different. It was like fingers testing the grain of the wood. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A slow, curious, and patient rhythm. The scratching stopped. A long, taut silence followed. Then, a deep thud. It wasn't an impact. It was weight, like a hand or a shoulder, being pressed flat against the underside of the floor. Testing the weakness, checking the pressure points. I lay there, clutching the blanket, every muscle locked. My mouth was dry. The sounds continued like that for about an hour, scratching, stopping, pressing, an intelligent, methodical process. When it finally ceased, I didn't dare move. I lay there, eyes wide open, until the first faint gray light of dawn crept through the curtains. In the daylight, the fear seemed absurd. I forced myself to go outside and check the crawlspace vents. Nothing was disturbed. No footprints, no claw marks. I told myself I was just overtired. It was being in an unfamiliar place. I continued packing all day, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The trapdoor in the kitchen floor. That thick oak hatch with an old metal ring recessed into it. All my childhood memories flooded back, and I realized something chilling. In all those years, I had never, not once, seen my grandparents open it. It was always there, flat, silent, as if it wasn't a door. It was a lid covering something. The second night, I had no illusions about sleeping. I lay there, blankets pulled to my chin, wide awake, waiting. Hours passed, only the ticking clock. Finally, despite my fear, my eyelids started to droop. Then, just after midnight, the scratching started again. This time, it was closer, clearer. I heard it move, young, no longer stationary. It traveled across the floor. And then it stopped. Right beneath my bed, the boards under the frame creaked, as if weight was being applied from below. I held my breath. My pulse pounded against my ribs. The scratching grew louder, more urgent, as if it was testing each board, looking for the thinnest part, directly beneath me. I fumbled for my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The screen lit up. No signal. I was completely cut off. The movement stopped instantly. An absolute silence. A silence even scarier than the noise. And then I heard it. A voice. Low and muffled, coming from right beneath me. The words were incomprehensible. Just the distorted, hoarse, wet shape of speech, like someone trying to whisper through a mouth full of mud, a sound that did not belong in this world. I wasn't thinking. My brain seemed to have disconnected, leaving only the primal instinct: run. I grabbed my purse, swung my legs over the side of the bed, and launched myself out of the room. The sound seemed to be chasing me. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped short. Something compelled me to look. The cellar door in the kitchen, it was open, but it hadn't been pushed up. It was lifting, slowly, impossibly, as if unaffected by gravity, as if it were being pulled up from below by an invisible hand. And through that gap, I saw it. Something pale was rising, a bare shoulder. But it wasn't human skin. It was stark white, taut and mud-caked, stretched over a bone structure that was too long, too thin. Then an arm, sickeningly frail, reached out. The long, bony fingers scraped lightly across the tile floor, not to grip, but as if to sample the new air. I didn't wait to see the rest. I hurtled down the stairs, my feet slipping on the rug. I slammed into the front door, the old latch flying open. I sprinted across the empty yard. My breath tore raggedly in my throat. The grass was wet and cold, clinging to my ankle, but I didn't care. I just kept running until I crashed into the edge of the woods edge. I pressed my back against the rough oak bark, fumbling to make my hands work. The phone, useless. Nothing. I crouched there, holding my breath, listening. Everything fell silent. And then, I heard the front door creak open. Footsteps, soft and deliberate. Moving down the porch steps, entering the yard, it stopped. Then it moved, closer. The sound wasn't like walking. It was almost silent, as if it could sense me nearby, but hadn't pinpointed exactly where I was hiding. I pressed my cheek to the bark, completely still. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest, so loud I was sure it could hear it. The steps wandered across the lawn, stopping occasionally. I thought I heard breathing, wet and labored, as if it were tasting the air, trying to pick up my scent. Finally, the steps drifted toward the far edge of the empty yard. I didn't move. I stayed there, huddled in the darkness, until the sky began to turn from black to the ashen gray of dawn. When there was enough light, I crept across the yard. My legs felt hollow, not my own. The front door was still wide open. Inside, the cellar door was closed, neat, flush, as if nothing had happened. The front door was open, like a mockery. But the cellar was sealed again. This wasn't an animal. This was something that thought, something patient, something that had once been human, or was trying to imitate it. I didn't care what I left behind. I just snatched the keys in the bag. I went straight out and drove. I drove, not daring to look in the rearview mirror, until the rows of trees receded and completely vanished behind me. And when the dirt road gave way to asphalt, a chilling realization hit me. I hadn't escaped. I had been let go. When I was 32, I became obsessed with a single thought. A thought I just couldn't shake off. I had to spend an entire week, completely alone, in the most remote corner of the Blue Valley Range. This wasn't a vacation. It was a compulsion, an itch deep inside my chest that wouldn't let go. Something lodged beneath my ribs, demanding to be answered. I'd been camping all my life, countless weekends, a few long hikes here and there. But the idea of completely disappearing, of truly going off the grid, clung to me. It felt like the final test, the only way to prove to myself that I could endure absolute solitude. The kind of silence that doesn't just surround you, it eats you from within. I threw myself into preparation, obsessively, almost manically. Every night, I'd spread out topographic maps across my kitchen table, tracing my finger not along trails, but over the blank spaces, the places where the map maker seemed to have given up. One night, I found an old ranger's handbook, yellowed and brittle, with a black and white photo of a ruined cabin. The title read, "The Uncharted Valleys of Blue Valley." That phrase stuck with me. Not undiscovered, uncharted, as if they had existed once. And someone had deliberately erased them. I left nothing to chance. A new tent, stormproof, backup batteries, a full medical kit, even a little hand crank radio. That was my only concession to civilization. A red box, a fragile talisman, a way to pretend I wasn't stepping off the edge of the map. I even packed 3 different knives, one on my belt, one in my pack, one tucked into my boot. Paranoid? Maybe, but it made me feel safe. Before leaving, I called my brother, Matt. I tried to sound casual. He didn't buy it. He sighed, that long, familiar sigh, and told me I was auditioning for my own missing person documentary. We both laughed. Mine came out hollow. That morning, I woke before dawn. My old Subaru groaned under the weight of my gear. When I reached Eastwick Trace, I realized it wasn't a road at all. It was a rumor. A patch of gravel off the highway, and a narrow gap between two lines of trees, barely wide enough for a deer trail. No signs, no markers. It was a threshold. On one side, the world I knew. On the other, darkness. I almost turned back, but the stubborn part of 32-year-old me won. I shut off the engine. The silence fell like a wall. I shouldered my pack and stepped in. The first day was a dream. 12 miles, not a soul in sight, just silence, thick, ancient silence. The only traces of humanity were warnings. A lone chimney standing in an empty clearing, like a broken tooth. A rusted barbed wire fence that ran a few yards, then simply disappeared into the woods. Not just remnants, graves. Graves of those who came here and failed. By late afternoon, I found it. A ridge overlooking a small hollow sheltered by 3 massive boulders. A natural fortress. The place felt defendable. I spent an hour building a solid fire ring. When the flames roared to life, cutting through the falling dark, I finally exhaled. It was a primal stillness, the kind that existed long before people. No cars, no planes, just the faint crack of a branch somewhere beyond the firelight. Dinner was a lousy instant meal, but it was hot. When I crawled into my tent, my hand rested on the knife at my belt. Always had been habit. This time, it was fear. Morning came, wrapped in fog, thick and white like a burial shroud. I brewed coffee. It tasted like burnt plastic, and walked the perimeter of my camp. The ridge sloped down into a narrow ravine I hadn't noticed the night before. It didn't just descend, it plunged straight into the mist, like a dark throat inviting me in. After lunch, curiosity won. I went down. The deeper I went, the colder and wetter the air became. The place was dead. No birds, no insects. Just a tomb-like silence. I found a length of heavy, rusted chain half buried in the leaves. A little farther on, bones. Small ones, picked clean. So clean, they gleamed white, as if they'd been boiled. I froze, listened. Nothing. On my way back up, just before leaving the ravine, I saw it. A patch of disturbed earth, fresh, dark, wrong, right beside the path. My heart skipped. The ground wasn't just dug up, it was churned, clawed. Too shallow, too wide to be an animal burrow. It looked horrifyingly like something had been trying to claw its way. Out. The primal part of my brain screamed, "Get out." Now. But the rational part, the stubborn, 32-year-old man, pushed it down. Just a badger, I told myself. Just your imagination. I didn't get any closer. I turned around, walked fast back to camp, trying hard to forget that patch of broken earth. That night, that patch of disturbed earth poisoned everything. The camp was no longer a refuge. It was a stage. The fire flickered and hissed, and the forest beyond became a dark theater, packed with invisible spectators. I stayed up later than ever, almost frantically. I threw branch after branch into the fire, not to stay warm, but to push the darkness back, to keep that tree line, that still, black wall, exactly where it was. My eyes darted everywhere, trying to pierce the night, turning every shadow into a shape, every rustle into a footstep. I was keeping watch, but I had no idea what I was watching for. When the last logs crumbled into a dying bed of embers, I finally crawled into the tent. My eyes burned. I zipped it shut, a thin layer of nylon, a pathetic illusion of safety. This time, I didn't just rest my hand on the knife. I drew it, gripped it tight. The cold steel couldn't drive away the chill sinking into my bones. I don't know when I fell asleep. I only know that I woke up. I woke in that strangled hour of the night, the dead silence before dawn. The moon hung high, a cold, merciless silver disk. Its light bled through the tent, painting the outlines of skeletal branches above me. For a second, I was disoriented. Where was I? Why did my chest feel tight, like someone was squeezing it? My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I woke up before I knew why, and then I heard it. A voice, deep, dry, and close. It said my name, once. Mark? It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a fact. A voice so rough it sounded like it came from a throat that hadn't known water in years. It knew I was there. It knew my name, and it was simply acknowledging itself. My whole body locked up. My throat clenched. I tried to swallow, but the air felt thick, heavy. My ears rang with a high, sharp whine. I lay still, frozen, breathless, waiting for footsteps, for the rip of fabric, for that voice. Again. But nothing came. Only the buzzing in my ears, only my own heartbeat pounding in my skull. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a dream. It had to be. An illusion. Stress. Isolation breaking my mind in half. I've had to believe that. Because, if it wasn't, Dad, I lay there, eyes wide open, gripping the knife, until the first sickly gray light began to crawl through the trees. I ripped open the tent zipper, ready for anything. There was nothing. No footprints. No broken branches. Just the same campsite, the dead fire, and the 3 silent boulders. That normalcy, that awful, perfect normalcy, was what truly drove me mad. I spent the entire 3rd day in a quiet panic. I forced myself to stay busy. I gathered firewood, constantly glancing over my shoulder, tried to fish, but couldn't stand still, rearranged my gear for no reason at all, just to keep my hands from shaking. But when the sun began to set, when the sky turned bruised purple, the pressure came back, heavy on my chest. It felt like the trees were leaning closer, like they were watching me. I knew I couldn't stay another night. This was a fatal mistake. The trip was over. The test was done. And I had failed miserably. Now the only goal left was survival. That night, I built a fortress of fire. I dragged every dry branch I could find and made a bonfire so large it roared, throwing monstrous shadows across the 3 stones. I leaned against one of them. I wouldn't sleep. I'd stay awake. I'd stay in control. It was a perfect plan, until it wasn't. The warmth, the exhaustion, the endless fear, they broke me. I drifted off. I woke to a biting cold. The fire was nearly gone, just a heap of glowing coals. For a few seconds, I thought I'd made it, that I'd survived the night. And then I heard it. From right behind the boulder I was leaning against, inches from the back of my neck. A breath. Slow, steady, deep, a wet, heavy inhale. And exhale. The sound of something massive. And it was right there, not hiding, not stalking, just breathing. As if it didn't care whether I heard it or not, and my hands shook violently. I almost dropped the flashlight. The radio, it was in my backpack. 10 steps away, 10 steps that felt like a mile. I was paralyzed, pinned to that rock by sound alone. I stared at the dying embers, afraid to move, unable to, look over my shoulder, and because I knew, with a certainty born from somewhere deep and primal, if I looked, it would look back. That breath never changed. It didn't quicken, didn't fade. It stayed steady, Mechanical. Inhale. Exhale. A perfect rhythm of pure torment. It pinned me to the rock. That sound, and the dying glow of the embers, became my entire world. I sat there, motionless, paralyzed, for what felt like an entire lifetime. And then, when the first sickly gray light of dawn began to seep through the trees, it stopped. It didn't fade away. It didn't retreat. It just ended. A sudden, crushing silence fell over me. I felt hollow, emptied out, as if every nerve, every drop of adrenaline in my body had burned away. I shot to my feet. My legs trembled, numb beneath me. This wasn't packing up camp. This was an escape. I stuffed my sleeping bag into my pack without folding it. Tent stakes dangled loose. Straps hung everywhere. I didn't care. I just had to leave. I moved fast, almost running, driven by the most primitive kind of fear. I didn't stop for water. The trail, wide and open just 2 days before, now felt like it was closing in. The trees leaned inward, their branches reaching out like arms, trying to pull me back. Every 10 seconds, I looked over my shoulder, certain I'd see something chasing me through the fog. I was about a mile from the car. I could almost smell safety. And then I stopped. So suddenly I nearly slipped on the damp leaves. Right in the middle of the path, a footprint. Not mine. Bigger than mine by at least 2 sizes. And sunk deep, impossibly deep, into the soft soil. As if something unimaginably heavy had pressed it there. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that there were no others. No prints leading to it. No prints leading away. Just one, alone, impossible, as if it had fallen from the sky, or as if something had been standing there, waiting for me to pass. I didn't take a picture until Monashir. I didn't analyze it. I ran. I burst out of the tree line, sprinted straight for the car. My hands shook so hard I dropped the keys twice. I yanked open the door, threw my pack into the passenger seat, and locked the doors. Before I even sat down, I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The roar of the engine was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. I drove like a madman, tires spitting gravel, never daring to look back. 10 miles. 15. Not until the cursed wall of trees finally gave way to open, sunlit fields, did I look into the rearview mirror. That was the last time in my life I ever went camping alone. There are places you leave behind, but they never really leave you. I grew up in a tiny, almost invisible patch of land in southern Missouri, the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked while driving through. I spent most of my 20s pretending I'd cut ties with it. I moved to St. Louis, got a job that didn't require boots, and convinced myself I'd never go back, unless it was for a funeral. Last October, my Uncle Randall died, so I drove home. The highway slowly gave way to thicker trees, and the air itself seemed to grow heavier with every mile. Honestly, the trip was more about duty than grief. After the funeral, a small, quiet service in the old brick church that always smelled faintly of lemon oil and the musty paper of hymn books. I stepped out into the parking lot and just stood there, hands deep in my pockets. I felt something, not stuck, exactly, but hollow, right beneath my ribs. It wasn't sadness. It was older than that. A splinter of the mind I'd carried since childhood, buried deep, but never removed. It was the weight of that town itself, the feeling of the hills pressing in on everything. That Sunday afternoon, on a whim, I packed a backpack. Nothing fancy, a tarp, my frayed old sleeping bag, a few protein bars, and the hunting knife I'd had since I was 17. My initials were still carved into the handle. I filled my thermos with whatever bitter, burnt coffee was left in the gas station pot and drove toward a trail I'd only ever heard whispered about after a few beers. They called it Jasper Bend. The official story, the one printed in the county's history book, said that back in the 1800s, a group of loggers disappeared out there. They blamed a landslide, a simple act of nature. But that's not the story you hear if you hang around long enough at the VFW Hall. The old men there talk about something else. They swear it was something unexplainable. They don't just talk about the Ozark Howler. They talk about something quieter, something that watches, something that can mimic voices, whistles, cries for help, to lure you deeper into the brush until your compass spins wild and the sun itself seems to vanish. They say people don't come back from there the same, that the reason the road isn't maintained isn't neglect, it's fears. By the time I turned off onto the gravel shoulder, the sun had already dipped behind the ridge, leaving a torn streak of purple-orange across the sky. A rusted gate hung from a single hinge. Beside it, a wooden sign so rotted the letters were nothing but faint grooves. For a moment, I thought about turning around, driving back to town, sleeping in my mother's damp living room, pretending to be normal. But the stillness out there, it felt different, like the only medicine left for that hollow ache inside me. I killed the engine, locked the car, and stepped through the sagging gate. The air changed immediately. This wasn't a trail. It was a scar through the woods, tight, choking, where every step crushed brittle twigs that snapped like breaking bones. The air hung heavy, almost stagnant. Every so often, the ground dipped into sudden trenches. I slipped once, and when I caught myself on a tree root, it felt damp and soft, in a way it shouldn't have. I looked up towards the ridge through a tangle of bare branches, and a cold thought crawled down my spine. It would be so easy to disappear out here. One wrong step, one bad fall, and you'd just be gone. No one would ever know where you went. About a mile in, I came across what must have been an old fence. The boards had collapsed, half swallowed by the earth, as if the ground itself was trying to digest them. Just beyond it, there was a small clearing, no bigger than my kitchen. It was ringed by stones, the remnants of a foundation, but it didn't feel like a home. At its center was a shallow, perfectly round pit, and from that pit grew a crooked, young tree. My throat went dry. Something about that tree was wrong. It twisted upward, as if it were trying to crawl out of the very hole that birthed it. The whole place didn't feel lived in. It felt used, like it had been meant for something else, something people once ran from. I skirted it in a wide arc, careful not to get too close. The last light of day was gone, swallowed by the tree line as the path curved down toward the riverbank. The water was pitifully low, more a glimmering strip of wet stone than a real stream, and its trickle sounded faint, tired. I found a flat patch of ground beneath a rock wall. It looked dry enough, though the thought of having a cliff face looming behind me didn't exactly feel comforting. My boots left sharp impressions in the damp mud, and for a moment, I just stood there, listening. The forest had gone completely still. No crickets, no birds, only the sound of my own breathing. When I bent down to set my pack down, that's when I saw them. Footprints. They came from the dry riverbed and led straight to the very spot I'd chosen to camp. They were faint, blurred by time or rain maybe, but they were there. My stomach nodded. They were narrow, too narrow, and unmistakably barefoot. But what froze my blood wasn't the shape. It was the stride, the space between the prints. It wasn't right, too far apart, as if whatever made them had leapt or moved in some off-kilter, lurching way that no human ever could. I swallowed hard, telling myself, Old tracks. Days old, maybe weeks. But the ground was still damp, and I knew I was lying to myself. I forced myself to set up camp. The little fire I built looked pathetic, just a trembling puddle of light that didn't chase away the darkness, but seemed to make it thicker, pressing in from every direction. I pulled out a book, but couldn't focus. The words danced uselessly on the page. All my attention was in my ears. And then I heard it. A whistle. 2 notes, low and eerily clean. Not a bird. Too perfect, too precise. It sounded once, then stopped, as if it were listening. A few taut seconds passed. Then it came again. Exactly the same 2 notes. It was waiting for an answer. My throat was dry. I cleared it and called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded thin, pitiful, and was swallowed whole by the woods. Nothing answered. The silence that followed was worse than any sound could have been. It wasn't empty silence. It was weighted. A silence that was waiting. I let the fire die and crawled into my tent. I didn't zip it all the way. Left a small gap, just in case. I lay on my back, hunting knife clutched tight to my chest, even though I knew it wouldn't help much. The thin layer of nylon was all that separated me from whatever was out there. My shoulders ached from the tension. I don't know how long I was out before I woke up, but when I did, my heart was already pounding hard enough to hurt. I was wide awake in an instant, horribly alert. I held my breath. I heard leaves. Crunching. Slow. Careful. 1 step at a time. It was close. Very, very close. Just outside. Moving along the rock wall. I prayed it would keep walking. But then, the footsteps stopped. Right outside my tent. The air inside felt thick, heavy, pressing down on me. And then, something pressed against the nylon. 1 single point of pressure, right above my knee. It wasn't a poke or a scratch. It was finger. It began to trace, slowly, deliberately, following the curve of my leg through the fabric. It was feeling me. My jaw locked so tight it hurt. I squeezed my eyes shut. I didn't dare breathe. Every muscle in my body went rigid. And finally, the pressure lifted. The pressure vanished. I heard the footsteps again, moving away. Still careful, still deliberate. Rustle. Rustle. Until the sound faded into the faint trickle of the river and the silence of the woods. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I lay there, my hunting knife slick with sweat in my grip, completely frozen, listening to my heartbeat pound like war drums in my chest. I stayed that way, I don't know how long, until the first sickly gray light of dawn seeped through the gap in my tent. When I finally gathered the courage to crawl out, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife. The morning air was cold and damp. I looked down, and my throat closed up. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The wet mud where its prints should have been was perfectly smooth. Only my own boot marks from the night before remained. Where it had stood, where it had pressed its finger into the tent, was spotless, unnaturally clean. That, more than the touch itself, is what broke me. The impossibility of it. Panic hit me like a tidal wave. I tore the campsite apart, shoved the sleeping bag into my pack, dragging the tarp behind me. I didn't care. I just had to get out. I didn't stop to eat. Didn't stop to drink. I barreled forward, almost running, the straps of my pack biting into my shoulders until they burned. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I could feel it, a cold pressure at the back of my neck. The unmistakable sense of being watched. I didn't look back, not once. When I finally stumbled out of the tree line and saw my truck through the trees, relief hit so hard my knees almost gave out. I staggered toward it, keys already clutched tight in my hand. And then I froze. Something was leaning against the driver's side door. It was a strip of tree bark, pale, bone white, the edges curled inward. Someone, had carved a figure into it, crude, but not childish. Long, spindly legs, an oval head, completely hollow, and no arms. It wasn't an attack. It was a message. It had seen me. It had touched me. And it wanted me to know, beyond any doubt, exactly where I'd been. I was 24 that year, and I had what I thought was a brilliant idea: to hop on the old tractor bike and ride along the trail behind my grandfather's farm in eastern Tennessee. They say youth has a way of being curious about the very places that used to terrify us as kids. My uncle, every time that hollow came up, spoke of it like it was a stain, a curse that clung to the family line. He'd lean back in his chair, thumb tracing the beer label, and mutter, "That hollow's older than any grave you'll find around here." Then he'd change the subject immediately, like he'd said too much. Back then, I always thought it was just superstition. Appalachia's full of stories like that, legends of things lurking in the deep woods, old warnings meant to keep kids from wandering too far and getting bit by a snake, or worse, getting lost. The locals called those places Hollers, and they weren't just valleys. They were places that knew how to keep people. I hadn't been back to that house in years, probably not since I was a restless teenager who thought he was too tough for ghosts. When my grandfather passed, someone had to come clean out what was left behind. And what was left behind was a mess. The house looked like it had been trying to sink back into the hillside from the moment he took his last breath. Kudzu vines had taken over like a green monster, swallowing everything. They crept across the porch, twisted around the gutters, even pushed their leafy fingers through the torn window screens. The old satellite dish was bent in half under their weight. Even the porch swing, Grandpa's favorite spot, had collapsed, as if it finally gave up. Inside was worse. Every room reeked of a mix of mold, old newspaper, and the sharp, sour smell of mouse droppings. It was the kind of stench that clung to your clothes and hair no matter how hard you scrubbed, like something that didn't want to let you go. I spent the entire day hauling out boxes, moth-eaten blankets, warped stacks of magazines, and cloudy glass jars sealed so tight the labels had rotted off. I kept telling myself I was making progress, but every time I turned around, another shadowed corner would reveal more fragments of a life I realized I barely knew. By dusk, my shoulders ached like they were full of molten lead. I remember standing in the kitchen, staring at the peeling Formica countertop, and feeling that crushing silence, the kind that fills a place after its heartbeat is gone. That's when I saw them, the keys to the Polaris ATV, hanging from a crooked nail by the doorframe. Such a small, stupid thing, a bit of plastic and metal, but it hit me like a spark of memory. I used to tear across the trails on that beast while Grandpa stood on the porch rail, pretending not to watch. He never said a word, just squinted, waiting to see what kind of stupid thing I'd do next, and usually, I didn't disappoint. I don't know what exactly pushed me to take it out that evening. Maybe it was the silence pressing down on me. Maybe it was the smell of decay, or maybe I just wanted to feel like a kid again, before everything got heavy, before I had to clean up what the dead left behind. Whatever the reason. I grabbed the keys, swung a leg over, and fired it up. The engine roared to life, loud and raw. For the first time all day, something felt alive. I steered it toward the trail behind the barn. Same old rutted path, just like when I was little. Back then, it had seemed endless, like it might lead straight to the edge of the world. The first stretch was cracked concrete, grass pushing through the seams, an old fence sagging beside it. A mile or so in, the pavement ended and the hard-packed clay took over. Deep ruts jarred the frame so hard my teeth clacked together. I actually thought for a second I might chip one. I passed the old hunting blind, a crooked plywood box nailed to the side of a black walnut tree. I remembered it from when I was a kid, but it was falling apart now. The boards were split, dangling like broken ribs. And the ladder. The ladder was snapped clean in half. The break didn't look like rot. Rot happened slow. This was different, rough, violent. Like something big had come down on it. Probably a bear down, I told myself. Just a bear. But my hand eased off the throttle all the same. The hair on my arm stood up. My uncle's words, older than any grave, echoed in my head. For a second, I thought about turning back. But I didn't. I was 24, not some superstitious kid. I told myself there was nothing out here but wood and rain and time. I was lying to myself, and somewhere deep down, I already knew it. I revved the engine and pushed on, blowing right past that first warning sign. About 15 minutes later, the trail began to narrow. The trees on both sides leaned in close, their branches tangling together overhead until they blocked out what little dying light was left. The hard clay beneath me dipped downward, leading into a wide, shallow basin ringed by bare, twisted blackthorn trees. And there, 3 old trailers sat half collapsed in a rough crescent. They looked like they'd been dragged out there decades ago and left to rot. The metal was rusted through in spots, the windows shattered, the doors long gone. A chill ran through me. This was the kind of place where nothing good had ever happened, where you half expected to see vultures picking at something they shouldn't be. That's when I noticed the tire tracks. Fresh ones. Too fresh. The dirt was still soft and damp where the treads had sunk in. My blood turned to ice. Someone had been here. Recently. I killed the engine. The sudden silence hit me like a punch. This wasn't the ordinary quiet of the woods. You know, the kind that hums with wind and insects and the occasional bird call. This was different. Empty. Hollow. No birds. No bugs. Not even the chirp of crickets getting ready for nightfall. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness that made every hair on my body stand up. I set the kickstand and stepped off. My boots sank into the soft ground, and the sound vanished, swallowed up, like even the earth was holding its breath. Each step felt slow, dragged out, as if I were wading through something thicker than air. When I reached the first trailer, I had to steady myself against the rusted doorframe because my legs were trembling. Inside, the floor was covered with damp leaves and scraps of stained carpet that squished under my boots. And in the far corner, a pile of bones. Small ones, maybe a dog, maybe a deer. The flesh had been stripped clean, but that wasn't what made my stomach twist. They were arranged, stacked carefully, neatly, in rows, as if whoever did it wanted them that way. Like an offering. Or a collection. My heartbeat went wild. I spun around to leave. Breath caught in my throat. And that's when I saw the cord. It was stretched across the doorway, right at eye level, so close I almost walked straight into it. Dangling from the line were small gray shapes, clinking softly together in a breeze I couldn't even feel. For a moment, I thought they were stones or bits of wood. Then I leaned closer, squinting in the dim light, and realized they were skulls. Tiny animal skulls. Each one drilled clean through the forehead, strung together like a necklace. My mouth went dry. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a chunk of broken concrete. I should have run. I should have turned around, sprinted back to the ATV, and gotten the hell out of there. But some part of me, cold, stubborn, dark, screamed that I had to know where those tire tracks led. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was compulsion. A desperate, gnawing need to see it through. Because if I turned back now, if I stopped here, I knew this place would haunt me worse than anything waiting ahead. So I kept going, I followed the trail past the 3 rotting trailers. The path twisted deeper into the valley, winding between the trees. Every so often, I'd pass a wooden plank nailed to a trunk. Strange symbols had been painted on them, circles crossed out, spirals wrapped around stick figures. Some of it looked like it had been drawn with something brown and crusted that flaked away when the wind touched it. I tried not to think about what it might be. I don't know how long I walked. 20 minutes? An hour? It felt like the sun was setting faster than it should have, like even time wanted me gone. The ground leveled out again, opening into a hollow so deep it was nearly black. The air turned cold and wet, thick enough to taste. This was it. It had to be the hollow my uncle warned me about. A collapsed stone foundation sank into the hillside, and there, an opening. A dark, gaping hole, just big enough for a man to walk through, if he was brave, or stupid, enough to try. I took a few slow steps forwards. 2 meters away, the smell hit me. A sickly sweet rot that clung to my throat and filled my lungs. I gagged, pulling my shirt over my nose. The flashlight in my hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy, like a useless lump of lead. But it was all I had. I clicked it on, and a thin, sickly beam of yellow light sliced across the thick darkness. In the far corner, a heap of burlap sacks, or what I thought were sacks, shifted. It wasn't a twitch. It was a slow, deliberate roll, like something heavy and wet inside was trying to turn over. Then I heard it. Breathing, wet, rattling, gasping, like lungs struggling to drag air through fluid. The stench, that sweet, rotten stench, hit me again, harder this time. My knees buckled. For one short, horrifying second, I thought I was going to collapse face first into that hole, into that smell. I forced myself backward, one shaky step, then a hand clamped down on my shoulder. Not a tap, not a grab, a grip. Strong. Inhumanly strong. The fingers dug into my flesh like steel hooks. My body locked up. My mind went blank. Every instinct to run, to fight, gone. There was only the pressure on my shoulder and the sound of that awful, wet breathing. Slowly, so slowly, I turned my head. A man stood there, right beside me, so close our sleeves nearly touched. He wore a faded canvas hat pulled low over his face, shadowing his eyes completely. His beard was matted gray and streaked with something dark, sticky, and he was smiling, a polite, empty smile. The kind of smile someone wears when they're pretending to be human. "Don't go in there," he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle, like he was giving directions to the post office. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My tongue felt glued to the roof of my mouth. He raised a dirt-caked finger to his lips. Shh. The smile didn't move. "You don't belong here. Turn around." I stood, frozen, paralyzed in a way I'd never known before. He leaned closer. His breath wasn't alcohol or tobacco, it was earth. Damp soil after rain. The smell of a freshly dug grave. He leaned to my ear. The polite tone vanished, replaced by something raw and jagged. "Run." It was like a curse breaking. Whatever had held me, his hand, his voice, the place itself, let go. I spun and bolted up the trail, my legs shaking so hard I nearly fell twice, slipping on wet leaves. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I did, I'd see him, or worse, I'd see whatever was in that cellar. And I knew, with absolute certainty, it would be something I'd never scrub from my mind. I don't know how long it took to reach the clearing. The 3 trailers loomed in the half-dark, their shattered windows gaping like silent mouths. I scrambled onto the ATV, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the keys. I fumbled in the dirt, found them, jammed them into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, the sound was the sweetest thing I'd ever heard. I twisted the throttle too hard. The tires spun. The rear fishtailed in the mud, then bit into the earth. I tore up the hill, flying through the dark, not caring about the ruts or rocks, or if I wrecked the damn thing. All that mattered was distance. Distance from that hollow. I didn't slow down until I saw the outline of the barn through the trees. I stopped under the porch and just sat there for a long time, my hands still gripping the handlebars so tight my knuckles went white. I tried to make sense of it all, to build some story that wasn't insane. A creature in a sack? A man who smelled like dirt? Who would believe that? They'd say I was tired, or drunk, or spooked by the woods. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard, what I'd smelled. My uncle had been right. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky in colors, far too cheerful for the night I'd just survived, I loaded the last of the boxes into my truck. I didn't call the sheriff. What would I even tell him? Instead, I slid the Polaris keys back under the loose brick on the porch, where I'd found them. Then I got in my truck and drove away. I left the house, I left the vines, and I left whatever lives in that hollow. And I swear, I will never, ever go back. I was 23 that year. I should have known how stupid the idea was, but somehow I convinced myself that helping my uncle clean out the old hunting cabin he'd inherited was the right thing to do. My uncle had been sick for months, too frail to make the long drive himself. So one evening, he called me and said it'd be simple. Drive up there, pack a few boxes, bring back anything worth keeping. He never mentioned how abandoned the place really was, how the road would fade into something that barely deserved to be called a road, or how completely isolated I'd be. No signal, no neighbors, no hint of civilization. I remember leaving my tiny apartment before dawn. The backpack sat on the passenger seat next to a thermos of hot coffee I swore I'd finish, but never touched. The first few hours were easy, smooth highway, semi-trucks roaring through the dark, everything familiar. Then I turned onto Route 212. That's when things started to fall apart. The asphalt cracked and broke apart, weeds clawing through like bony fingers. Then came the gravel, rattling against the undercarriage in sharp bursts that felt like warnings. Eventually, even that gave up, leaving me crawling along a narrow strip of red clay barely wide enough for my SUV. The trees began to close in, taller, older, maples and poplars leaning toward each other overhead, their branches knitting together until they formed a low, shadowed tunnel. It felt like the forest was folding itself shut, trying to keep me out. I'd lost signal long ago. Every few minutes, another ruin slipped by, a collapsed fence, a rusted oil drum, the ribs of a barn long dead. The smell was thick and sour, a mix of damp leaves, rotting wood, and something sharper, acidic, like the air itself had gone bad. It stung my throat. When I finally broke through into a small clearing, that creeping sensation hit me, the one you get when you know you're being watched, even though you're alone. I turned off the engine and just sat there, gripping the wheel, whispering useless lies to calm myself down. The cabin was smaller than I'd imagined, squat, hunched, its roof warped enough for daylight to stab through the gaps. The porch sagged dangerously to one side. I had the insane thought that if I stepped on the wrong plank, the whole thing might collapse. The yard was nothing but a patch of dead leaves pressed flat into the earth, ringed by low mounds that made it feel like the land itself was hiding. I got out, stretched, and walked toward the door. The handle shrieked under my palm, but it turned easily. The smell hit me first, so strong it almost made me black out. Old cigarette smoke, rot, and something sharp and metallic that burned the back of my throat. I flipped the light switch out of habit. Nothing. Just a silence so deep it felt like the house was holding its breath. I waited for my eyes to adjust. Then I spotted an old oil lantern on the counter. I struck a match, and its flickering flame painted the kitchen in a dim, sickly glow. The floorboards were split, the linoleum stained with dark patches too old to be just water. I decided not to look too closely. I got to work fast. The sooner I finished, the sooner I could leave. Most of the cabinets were empty, just mouse droppings and rusted cans. Every creak of the floor sounded like footsteps right behind me. I kept glancing over my shoulder until sweat slicked my palms. After 2 hours, my head throbbed, my back ached, and that single weak light from the lantern made the darkness outside the windows seem alive. I needed air. That's when I stepped onto the porch and saw it. A wire stretched between 2 trees, maybe 20 feet away. At first I thought it was a clothesline, but as I got closer, I saw the bones. Small, bleached bones, strung up with strips of torn cloth. Too tiny for a deer, maybe a rabbit, maybe smaller. They hung neatly in a row, swaying ever so slightly in a wind I couldn't feel. I told myself it was curiosity that pulled me forward. Symbols had been drawn on the scraps of fabric in dark, dried ink, simple but deliberate shapes. Circles bisected by lines, repeated with careful precision. They looked like runes, or charms, or warnings. I lifted my phone to take a picture. No signal, of course. Still, I snapped one out of habit. I stood there longer than I should have, studying those bones. My stomach clenched with a deep, instinctive dread. That feeling you get when you realize someone's been watching you the whole time. I went back inside the cabin, a chill crawling up my spine as I tried to convince myself none of it had meant anything. I just needed to finish. Get out. Fast. But nothing ever happens as fast as you want it to. The more I cleaned, the more junk I unearthed. Drawers jammed with tangled fishing lines, rusted lures, and an old canvas duffel that reeked of mildew. Everything felt abandoned, yet somehow not forgotten. Like whoever lived here had left in a hurry, but never truly let go. When I finally checked my watch, the hands had crawled past 6. The light outside was fading fast, shadows pooling at the edges of the clearing. The lantern's weak yellow glow now seemed to make the darkness beyond the windows even thicker, almost hostile. I was carrying the last box to the door when I heard it. Something heavy moving between the trees. Not the soft rustle of a small animal. This was deliberate, slow, weighty snaps of branches under pressure. I froze. The box almost slipped from my hands. For several long seconds, there was nothing, just silence so dense it made my ears ring. Then, the sound again. This time from the opposite side of the clearing, farther away. My mouth went dry. I swallowed hard and set the box down as quietly as I could. My brain scrambled for logic. A buck, maybe. Or a black bear scavenging. But something older, deeper inside me, knew better. The sound was too careful, too intentional. Whatever it was approaching. Then came the knocking. It started softly. From the back of the cabin, 3 sharp, hollow taps. Knock, knock, knock. It paused. The silence, stretching so long I thought my heart might stop. Then again, knock, knock, knock. My pulse pounded in my throat. I knew if I stepped out onto the porch to check, I'd regret it. So I stayed still. The knocking moved, slowly, deliberately, tracing along the wall toward the front of the cabin. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. Closer each time. I could hear the empty echo inside the wood. Sweat slicked my palms. I slammed the door shut and slid the latch across. Then I blew out the lantern. The room was swallowed by pitch-black darkness. I crouched low, one hand pressed to the cold floor, listening. The knocking stopped. A minute passed, then 2. I held my breath. When the voice came, it was so close I thought someone's lips were right against the wall. "You don't belong here. The words rasped, raw, and broken, like speaking them had scraped the speaker's throat bloody. My breathing turned shallow. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. Footsteps shifted outside, closer. "You should leave. Leave it." The voice tightened, low and dangerous. I swallowed hard. I had to say something. My voice came out thin and trembling. "I'm just here to pack up my uncle's things. That's all. Nothing. Just silence, thick and suffocating." Then the footsteps faded, melting back into the trees. I stayed crouched there, motionless. The room was freezing now. Through the window, the moon had risen high enough to spill a pale streak of light across the floorboards. Hours crawled by. Nothing else moved. My legs went numb from staying in the same position, but fear had nailed me to the spot. Eventually, I started to tell myself I'd imagined it all. That isolation had gotten inside my head, whispering things that weren't really there. Just when my brain was about to win the war against my fear, just when I started to believe I was safe, that I was nothing more than a paranoid fool, a single, heavy thud slammed against the back wall. I jerked so hard I nearly dropped the lantern. Another thud, then another. Then the pounding became rhythmic, steady, deliberate, circling the cabin in perfect measure. Each impact was strong and precise, like giant fists keeping time. It wasn't an attack. It was a message, a declaration that something out there knew exactly where I was. My hands were shaking so violently, it took me 2 tries to relight the lantern. I crawled to the door, pressing my ear against it, straining to separate sound from silence. The pounding stopped. I eased the latch and cracked the door open. Just a sliver. Nothing. Only the pale clearing, bathed in moonlight and the dark silhouettes of trees. Relief surged through me so suddenly, I almost laughed. I had beaten it. My own fear. Then my eyes drifted toward the wire. The bones were gone, every single one of them. Only the sagging wire remained, the white cloth strips fluttering limply in the breeze. Empty, gone, taken. That was all the confirmation I needed. The signal couldn't have been clearer. I bolted from the cabin, my boots slipping on the rotted porch boards. I didn't dare look back. My whole body had become pure instinct. Run. I wrestled the SUV door open, scrambled inside, slammed the locks, and jammed the key into the ignition. The headlights flared to life, sweeping across the tree line. That's when I saw them. Dozens of tall shapes, standing motionless among the trunks, upright. Still, they were too high to be bushes. I couldn't make out their faces, only the outlines of heads and shoulders, carved out of darkness. I floored the gas pedal. The SUV bucked and lurched over the ruts in the dirt road. In the rearview mirror, the clearing was empty, but every instinct in me screamed that they wouldn't stay that way for long. I drove like a man possessed. It took me half the time to reach the highway. I didn't breathe, really breathe, until I pulled into a gas station in Darnell, beneath the buzzing 2 bright lights. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, cold sweat sliding down my neck, waiting for my hands to stop shaking. I had just turned 24, the age when people think life is supposed to start making sense, when I agreed to help my cousin Paige clean out her late grandfather's old cabin. I'd grown up not far from the area, but the place sat so deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains that my phone lost signal a full mile before we even turned off the main road. That isolation should have been the first warning sign. Out here, in the thick of the woods, you slip out of sight, and once you lose connection, you're truly alone. The driveway looked more like an abandoned logging trail, just 2 ruts carved into the dirt, choked by weeds and fallen branches. You'd never even spot it if you didn't know exactly where to look. Even as our car jolted and rattled over the rough ground, I couldn't stop thinking how building a house here had been a terrible mistake from the start. There are places the forest is just waiting to reclaim, and this was one of them. Paige had put this off for nearly a month. Her grandfather had died alone in the kitchen. No one knew until the mail began to pile up on the porch, turning into collapsing stacks of envelopes, a silent monument to isolation. A neighbor finally noticed and called the authorities. By the time they broke down the door, the old man had been gone for days, maybe longer. That quiet, suffocating kind of death hung between us like a heavy, invisible fog. Paige had called me several times, saying she couldn't bring herself to go in alone. Her voice always trembled, fragile, as if she was afraid I'd think she was being overly dramatic. But I didn't. I understood perfectly. It wasn't just grief. It was the terror of solitude, the horror of dying unheard, unseen, and the suffocating silence that had swallowed that house whole. When we finally reached the clearing, the cabin looked even worse than I'd imagined. It wasn't just old. It looked defeated. The structure leaned to one side, as if trying to sink into the earth and disappear into the trees. Half the roof shingles were missing. One porch rail dangled, held up by a single rusted nail. I parked behind her Corolla, and for a long minute, neither of us moved. We just sat there, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. It was mid-afternoon, but the trees grew so tall and close that the yard was drowned in a dim, sunless haze, like a moment the daylight had forgotten. I tried to push down the unease coiling in my stomach. "You brought a flashlight, right?" she asked, still staring straight ahead. "Yeah," I said, opening the glove box and pulling out my heavy metal mag light. Just holding it made me feel a little steadier, a small, tangible comfort against the vast emptiness around us. She exhaled shakily, then opened her door. The wooden steps creaked under our weight. I half expected them to give way, but they held. When I nudged the front door open with my shoe, it swung inward slowly, like it had been waiting for this moment a very long time. The smell hit me first, a wall of stench so dense it was almost solid. It was a thick, rotten mix of mold, decay, and old cooking grease, with something sharper beneath it, metallic, unnameable. The kind of smell that clings to your hair and clothes and won't let go. Dust coated everything, swallowing sound. In one corner sat a sagging recliner beside a folding table stacked with yellowed newspapers and half-eaten cans of food. Paige pulled her t-shirt up over her nose. "God, it's worse than I thought," she muttered. "Let's just get it done," I said, trying to sound calm, practical. We split up without another word. She started in the living room, tossing old mail into garbage bags. I went into the kitchen. The linoleum floor was cracked and peeling at the corners. And right there, beside the stove, was a dark stain that I didn't have to look at twice to know what it was. I didn't linger. I opened a few cabinets, more out of obligation than curiosity. Inside were cereal boxes so old the cardboard had gone soft, and jars that once held jam, now just gray, lifeless sludge. Down the hall, I peeked into the bedroom. Shelves lined the walls, packed with identical jars. Some were labeled in crooked handwriting, okra, beans, peaches. But most were unlabeled, their contents reduced to shapeless, gray mush that made my stomach tighten. It reminded me of old farm traditions, stockpiling, preserving, but this felt different, private, wrong. Then I saw a jar on the bottom shelf. Inside was something pale, curled, almost like a small animal suspended in cloudy liquid, not fully submerged. It had no label. For a split second, a horrifying thought crossed my mind. Was it still breathing? I stumbled back, slammed the door shut. The click of the latch echoed sharply in the silence. I hauled an armful of old blankets outside and dumped them in a pile. Each time I went back in, the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the house itself were exhaling against me. Paige didn't say much, but every now and then, I caught her glancing down the hallway, her eyes fixed on that closed bedroom door. Once, I asked her what she was looking at. She just shook her head. A small, helpless motion filled with quiet, wordless fear. We worked in near total silence for hours. The only sounds were the crinkle of trash bags and the groan of old floorboards underfoot. But the silence wasn't peaceful, it was watchful. It felt tight and waiting, like the air right before a storm breaks, that unbearable stillness before something awful happens. As the light began to fade, the clearing outside darkened quickly, pressing its shadow against the grimy window panes. I checked my watch, and my throat tightened. It was almost 5. "We need to check the basement before it gets completely dark," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, practical. She froze. Her hands were buried in a box of old papers, but she didn't move. "Grandpa never let me go down there," she whispered, her voice splintering. "He said it wasn't safe. He said there were things down there the light couldn't reach." I tried to sound calm, even though my words came out tense. "Not safe how? Faulty wiring? Weak foundation?" I wanted logic, something solid to silence the growing unease in my chest. She just shrugged, shoulders tightening until they nearly touched her ears, like she was bracing for a blow. She wouldn't look at me. I decided not to push it. Instead, I made my way to the back of the kitchen and yanked open the basement doors. The hinges screamed, a long, painful creak that tore through the stillness like a blade. A rush of air poured out, cold, but not just cold in temperature. It felt wrong, heavy, dead. The beam of my flashlight trembled as I started down the stairs. They were steep and narrow, made from rough wood that looked ready to splinter. My boots left damp prints on the old boards. I couldn't help but think how easy it would be to fall, to snap your neck in this kind of darkness. Halfway down, the stench hit me like a physical blow. It was the reek of wet fur mixed with something sour and unmistakably rotting, worse than the mold upstairs. It was animal, primal, the kind of smell that made bile rise in your throat. I forced myself to breathe through my mouth, aiming the flashlight ahead. The basement floor was packed earth, uneven, damp, pitted. My light swept across a large wooden workbench, its surface carved with shallow gouges and knife marks, like something had been methodically worked on there. Dissected. Rusty iron hooks hung above it, gently swaying, as if something had brushed past them seconds ago. I panned the beam along the walls and saw it again. The same nightmare collection from the bedroom. Rows of shelves lined with glass jars. The liquid inside was a murky yellow, and what floated within didn't look like anything from the natural world. I started to move closer, just to take a quick look and get it over with. Then I heard footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate. "Paige," I called out. No answer. My heart slammed against my ribs. I sprinted up the stairs 2 at a time. I was almost at the top when the door slammed in my face. The latch clicked shut, a sharp, final sound that froze me to the bone. I was locked in. "Hey!" I pounded my palm against the wood until it burned. "Paige, open the door!" Her voice came through, trembling, breathless, thick with panic. "Eloan, someone's outside." My mouth went dry. "What do you mean, someone? Who?" "He's standing in the woods," she screamed. She was right on the other side of the door, but her terror was aimed behind her, toward the dark beyond the house. I pressed my forehead against the rough wood. "Just open the door, okay? We'll leave right now. Just open it." "He's looking at me." Then I heard her footsteps retreat. Bo. That sight, the horrifying realization that I was trapped in a dark cellar with a human-shaped nightmare, eyeless and mouthless, wiped every trace of reason from my mind. Pure panic took over. The only thought left was escape. I threw my full weight and strength against the door. The wood splintered, a sharp, cracking sound that echoed through the darkness. The creature hesitated, its pale head tilting slightly to one side. I slammed into the door again, then a third time. On that final hit, the latch gave way. The door flew open so suddenly that I stumbled backward into the kitchen. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting across the room. Paige stood frozen, her expression blank, her wide eyes staring past me, out the front window. She looked completely lost, emptied out. "Where is he?" I gasped, lungs burning. "Paige, the man in the woods. Where is he?" Her voice came out flat, hollow, stripped of fear or emotion. "He went back into the woods." I didn't wait another second. That calm, detached tone terrified me almost as much as what I'd just seen below. I grabbed Paige by the wrist, gripping tight, and practically dragged her through the living room, across the porch. We didn't take anything, left it all to the house and the dark. The only goal was to get off that land. My truck was still there. I shoved Paige into the passenger seat, slammed her door shut, and jumped behind the wheel, praying for mercy. I turned the key. The engine roared to life with a guttural, saving growl. I threw it into reverse, tires screeching, and spun the wheel hard. I didn't dare glance back until we were halfway down the overgrown path. Through the rear window, something moved between the trees. Tall, too tall, thin and fluid. It glided beneath the canopy with a grace that made no sense, motion that defied every rule of anatomy or physics. That was the final confirmation. Cold and absolute. Whatever lived out there, whether it was the man in the woods or the thing I saw in the cellar, they weren't human. Paige let out a strangled sob and clapped a trembling hand over her mouth, swallowing her terror. I floored the accelerator, gravel spraying behind the tires as the old truck shuddered under the strain. We didn't speak, not one word. Not until the wheels finally hit paved road, until the dark and the horror of Blue Ridge were somewhere behind us, buried in the trees. Between us, there was only silence. A heavy, stunned silence, weighted with everything we couldn't explain. I was 26, the year my cousin Mason decided we had to explore a place called Fox Hollow. It sounded ridiculous. Growing up in eastern Kentucky, you'd think we'd already worn grooves into every ridge and valley before we even learned to drive. But somehow, that patch of forest had always stayed off our personal map. And to be honest, I had never planned to change that. Everyone in our county knew the stories about Fox Hollow. My grandfather, a quiet man with eyes that always carried too much, would sit on the back porch with his sweet tea and talk about the hunters who never came back. They followed the old trails, and then nothing. Their trucks and gear were found days later, but not a single footprint past the last marker. He used to say, in that low, heavy voice, that the mountains had swallowed them. And when he looked out at the tree line as he said it, it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a confession, like he knew something he couldn't or wouldn't share. Appalachian folklore about those old forests is darker than ghost stories. My grandfather whispered about something alive between the trees, a biological thing, a predator, ancient and intelligent, older than the settlers, older than the soil itself. Mason couldn't be more different. He was the archetype of the modern skeptic. If it wasn't captured in 4K video, it didn't exist. He laughed off every warning, claimed those stories were just scare tactics to keep people out. This time, he had a brilliant idea to camp in what he called a white spot on the map. No cell service, no roads, no signs, just trees, silence, and his own arrogance. I tried to talk him out of it, but truthfully, I didn't want him to think I was weak. After years of trying to look strong in front of someone, it's hard to stop at the edge of common sense. And that's how we ended up bouncing down a dirt road in his old pickup, heading toward a rusted iron gate forgotten by time. I remember him honking like we were arriving at a friend's house before jumping out to shove the gate open. The hinges screamed, a long metallic cry that sounded too much like something dying. Mason thought it was hilarious. I didn't. When I stepped out, the air hit me. It wasn't just damp. It smelled metallic, mixed with rot and something faintly coppery and cold. It raised goosebumps across my arms. I tried to ignore it while we packed our gear. The first few miles were uneventful, green, quiet, ordinary. The trail was an old service road, lined with puddles from the last rain. I kept expecting to see another hiker, but the woods were utterly still. No distant engines, no chatter, only the occasional bird. Mason looked back once and said, "Feels like we stepped out of time, like the world ended behind us, and we just didn't notice." He had a way of saying things that sounded poetic and unsettling all at once. Every few miles, we stumbled on traces of long-gone settlers, a lone stone chimney, shattered glass bottles, a rusted iron stove sinking into the moss. I couldn't shake the thought of those families. Did they leave on their own, or did something make them leave? That first night, we set up camp beside a shallow creek. Mason quickly got a fire going with his overpriced survival kit, bragging about not needing matches, while I silently thought a lighter would have done the trick. I focused on boiling noodles and not on the feeling that something was watching us from the tree line. My skin prickled, the same cold awareness you get waking from a nightmare you can't quite remember. Mason didn't notice a thing. He was too busy praising YouTube bushcraft videos, as if algorithms could protect us from what was out there. I lay awake long after his snores filled the clearing. The fire had burned to embers, and the trees seemed to close in tighter each time I blinked. Then it started, the faint rustle of dry leaves, soft and slow, deliberate, the sound of footsteps trying to disguise themselves as wind. I held my breath, and it stopped. I exhaled, and it began again, over and over, until I was almost sure I was hallucinating from lack of sleep. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because when I opened my eyes, the light was thin and gray. We packed up our gear without saying a word. I guessed Mason was hoping that silence would make me forget the look on my face last night. But it wasn't just that I didn't want to talk. Speaking it aloud, turning those sounds into something real, felt far worse than keeping them trapped in my head like a half-remembered nightmare. By the second day, the trail had turned hostile. It was no longer a service road, but a narrow, uneven deer path. We had to clear fallen branches, squeeze through dense trees, and watch for holes hidden beneath the brush. It was clear this forest didn't want a path. It was actively erasing any trace of human presence. Around midday, Mason spotted something strange, a wooden sign nailed high into a tall poplar tree. The wood was split, the paint almost bleached white, but I could still read 3 words, stark and merciless. No return trail. He burst out laughing, said it was probably the work of some eccentric trying to freak people out. I couldn't laugh. I didn't even answer him. All I could think about was this. Whoever made that sign had to carry lumber and nails deep into this forest just to hang a warning. That wasn't a prank. That was a desperate attempt, a message from someone who'd tried to escape and failed. A final warning. Later, we stopped to eat on a rocky outcrop. The slope beneath us dropped almost straight down, a vertical chasm so deep I couldn't see the bottom. I was tearing open a protein bar when I saw something move below, between the trees. At first, I thought it was a moose, tall, pale, gliding silently through the ravine. But then it stood up. Its arms were far too long, almost reaching its knees. I knew immediately that something about its proportions was wrong. No natural creature was built like that. It turned its head slowly, deliberately, as if calculating each tree, each patch of shadow. When its face tilted toward the sky, I saw its jaw, or what was left of it. It wasn't opening its mouth. It was split. Right down the middle, torn deep and gaping wide, exposing a grotesque inner structure I couldn't even name. My breath caught in my throat. My entire body froze. The protein bar crumpled in my hand, wrapper tearing apart. My stomach twisted violently, begging to empty itself right there. The horror wasn't just visual, it was physical. A shock that crawled through my spine. This thing wasn't something that evolved. It was wrong. An aberration. Then it stepped back, slipped behind a thicket, and vanished. I just sat there, trembling, staring at the space where it had been. Eventually, Mason noticed my expression. He asked if I was sick. I tried to answer, but my throat had gone dry and rigid, glued shut by fear. I only managed a nod, silently begging him to stop looking at me. We didn't talk after that. I knew he felt something had shifted between us. My fear was no longer hesitation. It had become a cold certainty. We'd been seen, and the legends of Fox Hollow were real. That night, we camped in a narrow hollow, barely enough room for 2 tents. We didn't light a fire. I didn't want any glow giving away our position to whatever had seen me. I lay there in the dark, where the silence grew heavy, pressing down on everything. I lay awake, counting the calls of whippoorwills, clinging to those natural sounds. But then, the spaces between each call began to stretch, unnaturally long, and my stomach tightened. When the calls stopped altogether, sudden and absolute, I felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something, and then a voice drifted out from the trees. At first, it was just a low murmur, too faint to make out the words, but it grew louder, clearer, and every hair on my arm stood straight up. It was my mother's voice, soft, familiar, the same gentle tone she used to soothe me as a child when I was afraid of the dark. "Cowan," it called, with that slight quiver in her vowels that I knew too well. My chest felt hollow, cold. The rational part of my brain scrambled for an explanation. Wind, echo, some half-buried memory rising up. But deep down, I knew it was her, or rather, it was using her. That voice wasn't just mimicry, it was a psychological snare, crafted to trigger the oldest instinct in me, the need to be comforted, to go home. I rolled over, reached to shake Mason awake. My hand hit cold nylon. His sleeping bag was empty. I scrambled out of the tent so fast I almost fell. My flashlight wobbled in my hand as I sucked in a lungful of air, still metallic, still wrong, and called his name. My voice came out small, swallowed instantly by the trees. Then I heard my mother's voice again, farther away now, down the slope. Some mad part of me wanted to run toward it, to believe that she'd be there, waiting with that same warm smile. But something deeper, older, froze me where I stood. I swung the flashlight in a slow arcs. That's when I saw it. About 20 yards away, half hidden behind a black oak. It was standing there, watching me. Its skin looked stretched too tight over a frame that didn't make sense. Its long arms hung low, fingers brushing the leaves. Its chest rose and fell, slow, deliberate. The worst part was the absence of eyes. If it had eyes, maybe I could have looked away. But that blank, eyeless face forced me to face it, the warped, wrong shape of it. It moved, sliding sideways around the tree, its shoulders and ribs twisting in ways no vertebrate should. It circled slowly, patiently, like a hunter that already knew I couldn't decide whether to run or stay frozen. I stumbled backward, tripping over a rock. The beam of my flashlight shook wildly across the trees. And then I saw a second one, just a flicker of pale skin between the trunks. That broke whatever paralysis was left. I ran. I crashed through briars, over fallen logs. Branches whipped my face and arms. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would rip through my ribs. Behind me, voices rose, not one, but many. My mother's voice, then Mason's, then mine, all calling my name, at different pitches and tones, a chorus of chaos chasing me through the dark. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran. The darkness blurred everything except the one thought pounding in my head. Don't stop. Keep moving. When I finally stumbled onto the old service road, the sky was just beginning to lighten with dawn. My legs gave out. I dropped to my knees, gasping so hard my throat burned. Then, a forest ranger's truck rolled slowly toward me. The ranger stepped out carefully, as if afraid to startle me. He helped me into the cab, gave me water, tried not to show how worried he was. When he asked where Mason was, I couldn't answer. I just shook my head. I never told him what I saw. I never mentioned the voices, or the eyeless thing. And the worst part is, I had the cold, sinking feeling that I should have, because maybe he would have believed me. I spent the entire summer working a supposedly simple conservation job in the southern stretch of the Blue Ridge Mountains. On paper, it sounded like an idyllic chance to reconnect with nature, but in truth, it was mind-numbingly dull. Most days, it was just me, a clipboard, and a sweat-soaked shirt as I tried to determine whether a tiny patch of moss was the same species I had logged 2 weeks earlier. Our team was small, only 6 people, and we rotated through tasks that were anything but pleasant, mostly driving into remote areas so far removed from civilization that you'd wonder why anyone bothered keeping them on the official maps at all. The veterans called those places the Forgotten Tracks, a name that had always sounded overly dramatic to me. But after what happened, I think the word forgotten feels almost too generous. I'll never forget the morning they assigned me to Track 14. It was the first Monday of June. We worked out of an old ranger station whose tin roof was so thin that by noon it would pop and crack like popcorn under the sun. Elena, my supervisor, handed me a file folder. She said only one thing, her voice carrying both fatigue and a hint of warning. Good luck. That one's a black hole. She wasn't exaggerating. The moment I opened the folder, a musty, stale odor rose up, the smell of paper that had been left untouched for decades. More than half the documents were copies of copies, smeared and almost unreadable. The most recent field report was dated 1978. The surveyor then was a man named Brooks. His report was little more than a rough list of trees and plant species, but at the very end, scrawled in faded ink, was a single handwritten line, like a buried warning. Old dwelling remains. Advise caution. That was it. No explanation. No follow-up notes. I remember thinking he'd probably just been spooked by a black bear or a nest of owls. I really wish that had been the case. I signed out one of the old gray GPS units, the kind that loses signal if you breathe too hard, and loaded my pack into the truck. The drive was hell. The gravel gave way to twin ruts of clay mud, and at points the weeds between the tracks grew taller than the bumper. It took nearly 2 hours to pass the last mailbox of civilization, and by then my nerves were stretched tight as wire. Eventually, the road simply gave up pretending to be a road. I pulled over where it vanished into a mess of grass and branches. When I stepped out, the silence hit me, thick and unnatural. It wasn't the quiet of nature. It was the kind of silence that swallows sound, that makes your ears ring. I turned slowly, scanning for any sign of human presence. Finally, I spotted a sagging post fence, more termite colony than boundary line. 8 feet up a sycamore tree was a warped board with the number 14 burned into it. That was the only confirmation I needed. I was in the right place. I slung my pack, adjusted my compass, and stepped over the rotting fence. After maybe 20 paces, the road behind me was completely gone. The trees here were enormous, trunks as thick as grain silos, their branches woven into a canopy so dense I couldn't see the sky. The first hour was a steady climb, and I trusted my compass more than any piece of electronics. While following a ridgeline, I noticed a small depression among the trees. I shifted position to get a better look, and there it was, a stone foundation tucked into a hollow. It felt impossibly out of place, like a grave from another century. I knew I should have marked it and moved on, but something tugged at me. It felt as if the place was waiting for me, like it had a secret meant only for me to uncover. It was ridiculous, but I went anyway. I climbed down. The foundation was a rectangle of stacked stone, half collapsed. Inside sat a rusted stove, its chimney bent sideways in an oddly deliberate way. I started scraping aside layers of dead leaves with my boot. Everything I uncovered felt like a fragment of a story cut off mid-sentence. A bent spoon, a faded lunchbox, barely showing the ghostly outline of a smiling cartoon bear family. I flipped the latch on the lunchbox. Inside was a tightly rolled piece of blue cloth and a small handful of marbles. They were still bright, their red, yellow, and blue swirls vivid as if they'd been placed there yesterday. I don't know why, but that detail, the persistence of color amid decay, sent a chill racing up my neck. I leaned down, rolling one cold marble between my fingers, and that's when I heard it. I was crouched there, my fingers tracing the cold glass marble, when I heard it. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like something heavy shifting its weight from one foot to the other on damp earth. I froze. My first thought, instinctively, was a bear, but that thought vanished as quickly as it came. Bears don't move like that. They crash. They break branches. This sound didn't. It was just movement. The shifting of mass. I shot upright, heart hammering in my chest like a trapped bird. Slowly, I turned a full circle, scanning the dense tree line. Nothing. Just dim light slipping through the canopy and shadows that seemed too deep. I tried to convince myself it was some wild animal, but my skin felt too tight, too aware, like it was bracing for something far worse than a simple encounter. I stepped back through the crumbled stone wall and circled the edge, searching for tracks. That's when I heard the second sound, clearer this time, higher up the slope. A low branch snapped with a sharp crack, followed by a dull, muffled thud. I called out, trying to sound calm, but my voice came out higher and shakier than I wanted. "Hello, I'm just with the Conservation Survey." Silence answered me. I climbed a few steps toward a lone tulip poplar, its pale bark like old bone. Leaning around it, I prayed I'd see nothing, and that's exactly what I saw. No animal, no person, but the ground was marked. A footprint, pressed deep into the soft soil and dead leaves. Not a hiking boot, but a hard leather shoe with a thick sole. The print wasn't old. The heel had dug in hard, like whoever left it had pushed off in a desperate rush to run. Something inside me changed in that moment. Rational thought just broke. It was like a switch flipped from curiosity to pure, cold panic. I needed to get out. I turned and started running downhill, breath ragged, each step heavier than the last. My GPS was dead, screen black, lifeless. I kept it in my hand anyway, clinging to it like a lifeline to the real world. As I ran and the forest shifted, the trees seemed to grow closer together, the shadows thicker. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone or something watching. I was halfway back to where I thought the fence line was when I heard it. "Go back." Soft but clear. A dry, cracked whisper, more like a radio signal breaking through static than a human voice. I froze, every nerve in my body tuned to listen. Nothing followed, just that awful, heavy silence. Then it came again, closer this time. No mistaking it. "Go back." Cold sweat ran down my spine. I took a step back, then another, trying to tell myself it was just the wind. But I knew better. The forest had been silent for too long to suddenly find a voice. The third time it came, it wasn't louder, But it was inside my head, Dere, scraping against my skull in that same brittle whisper. Go back, oh. Something inside me broke completely. I bolted. I didn't care which direction I was running or how much noise I made. My pack slammed against my back with every stride. Branches whipped across my face and tore at my arms, but I didn't slow down. I crashed through a thicket of rhododendrons, lungs burning, gasping for air. When I finally stumbled to a stop, shaking, I had to grab a thick old tree just to stay upright. I bent over, chest heaving. Everything around me looked wrong, distorted by fear. Like the forest itself had changed while I wasn't looking. I forced myself to swallow, to think clearly. If I just kept moving downhill, I'd eventually hit the road. That was my only anchor in this panic. I started walking again, slower this time, trying not to make a sound. But the forest wouldn't let me go. It pressed closer, the trees crowding together, as if the woods themselves were trying to bury me in darkness. After what felt like an hour, an endless stretch of dread, I saw a faint streak of light ahead. It didn't look real, just a pale line threading between the trunks. But I knew what it was. The road. Relief flooded through me. I pushed faster, then broke into a desperate sprint. Some terrified part of me believed that if I didn't reach it fast enough, that light would vanish. I burst out of the trees, stumbled onto the gravel road, and nearly fell to my knees. My truck was still there, right where I'd left it, weeds brushing against the bumper. My breath came in ragged gasps, the flood of relief so sharp it made me tremble harder than fear itself. And then, God help me, I turned around. I don't know why, maybe some deep, primal instinct to make sure the nightmare was truly behind me. At first, there was nothing, just the tangled dark of the woods. Then something stepped out from the tree line. It was tall, wrapped in an old canvas coat, stained dark with something I couldn't name. I couldn't see a face beneath the hood or the high collar. Only blackness. Slowly, deliberately, it lifted one arm and pointed back toward the forest I had just escaped. It wasn't a wave. It was a command for silence. I didn't wait. I climbed into the truck, hands shaking uncontrollably. The keys slipped twice before I managed to jam them into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I slammed it into reverse, gravel spraying in all directions. Then I tore down that road without once looking into the rearview mirror. When I got back to the ranger station, I handed in the GPS and the logbook without saying a word. Everyone called Track 14 a black hole because it was worthless for data collection. But I knew the truth. It wasn't empty. It was a trap. And I swear, I will never or ever go back there again.